Sei que estou vendo algumas caras novas, então vou explicar só bem rapidinho do que se trata, né, esse seminário sobre resistência civil. É um seminário organizado graças a esse professor, Maciej Bartowski, que é diretor sênior do International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, que fica em Washington, e organiza seminários como esse no mundo inteiro, né? Então, eles são os nossos convidados por 3 dias bem intensivos e interessantes para a gente discutir vários aspectos do tema resistência civil. Agora vocês vão escutar a professora Erica Chenoweth, que é professora da Universidade de Denver, tem muitas publicações sobre esse tema. Em 2014, recebeu um importante prêmio, que é o prêmio Karl Deutsch, da International Studies Association. Então, é um enorme prazer termos esses pesquisadores convidados. Stephen Zuns, que está ali atrás, vai ser o palestrante a partir das 4 horas. A gente vai ter, então, a palestra da professora Chenoweth, depois um breve intervalo com lanchinho, e a palestra do professor Stephen Zuns. Para quem está chegando agora, o seminário começou, né, ontem de manhã, mas vocês são muito bem-vindos, e o seminário continua amanhã o dia todo. Amanhã, a partir das 9 da manhã até as 5h30 da tarde, tem o último dia do seminário. Então, obrigada pela presença de vocês, obrigada aos palestrantes. Eu vou passar a palavra para a primeira palestrante da tarde. Pessoal, na página do Facebook do evento, que vocês acham muito facilmente, se não me perguntem, ou perguntem, né, para o pessoal da organização, tem instruções sobre como acessar a página web do evento, né, que o International Center on Nonviolent Conflict fez esse enorme favor para a gente de preparar uma webpage com muito material gratuito para vocês fazerem o download. Então, tem vídeos, capítulos de livros, e tem também os slides das apresentações. Todas as apresentações do seminário estão lá à disposição de vocês. É uma plataforma feita para vocês, tá? Então, acessem a página do Facebook, lá tem as instruções para fazer esse acesso, e qualquer coisa eu estou à disposição de vocês para ajudar.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here this afternoon. One question I have is, how many people have been here to a seminar earlier, yesterday or this morning? Okay. So one of the questions that has come to us over and over again is the association between violence and nonviolence, and whether nonviolent and violent resistance methods go together and work together, or do they work against one another? And the topic for the presentation now is the question of specifically how does the adoption of violence by a small number of people within an otherwise nonviolent campaign impact its political effects? So how does the behavior of a small group of violent actors affect the overall political effects of a larger nonviolent movement? So to start and motivate this conversation, I first wanted to show you a slide from some of my recent data looking at the success rates of major nonviolent and violent resistance campaigns from 1900 through 2015. And these are, as I mentioned yesterday, campaigns of resistance where there are at least 1,000 people observed participating, and where the goals that they claim are to either overthrow the existing national leader through extra-constitutional means, or to create an independent country through secession, self-determination, or the removal of a foreign military occupation. So these are maximalist campaigns. And what you can see is that even though yesterday I showed trends showing that nonviolent campaigns were increasing their effectiveness over time, in the past 5 years, we've seen the effectiveness of nonviolent campaigns decline. And so this leads to a really serious puzzle for those of us that study nonviolent resistance from an empirical perspective. And it's somewhat of a paradox because nonviolent campaigns are becoming much more common around the world, much more common than armed resistance. Yet as they're becoming more common, they're becoming less effective. So why is that? And one of the different arguments that I would speculate is having an impact on this is the argument that as nonviolent campaigns become more prominent around the world, they've also started to accept, tolerate, or even adopt some violent contention within them that is actually diminishing their overall effectiveness. So take a look at this next slide, which shows the impacts, or the potential impacts, of the same sample, and looking at the percentage of the nonviolent episodes, the red line, over time, that feature some form of violence within a predominantly nonviolent campaign. So this is like people throwing rocks at police, or burning down police stations, or assaulting counter-protesters, or beating people up, or engaging in different types of self-defensive violence that look violent from the other side. So this violence might not be lethal, but when people take pictures of the movement, it often is featured in those pictures. And that compares with predominantly nonviolent campaigns, where people don't engage in those types of behaviors, even when they engage in highly disruptive and confrontational nonviolent tactics, but that those nonviolent tactics don't threaten or directly harm any person on the opponent's side. So if you look at the red line, you can see that the proportion of nonviolent episodes that have these violent flanks has increased in the last 10 years, whereas the proportion of campaigns without them is declining. So what do I mean by nonviolent and violent action? Let me define specifically the terms that I'm using, because they're different from some other conceptions of violence. So violence, in measurable terms, to me, is action or practices that directly physically harm or threaten to directly physically harm the opponent, another person. And there are lots of other kinds of violence: structural violence, psychological violence, and other forms of direct harm that are very difficult to observe over time and across cases. Non-physical violence can be a very relative term. Let me give you a concrete example from the United States, in the state of New Mexico, where I grew up. So there was a man who lived with his wife and his adult daughter. He was a colonel in the United States Air Force. His adult daughter, and they were very conservative family, very religious. His adult daughter went out to a bar one night and didn't come home until early the next morning, when she came home and it was clear that she had spent the night with a man. So when she walked into the house, her father was waiting for her, and he said, "Get in the car." And so she came back out of the house and got in the car, and he got in the car and said, "Call the dog." And so she called the dog, and the dog got in the car, and they drove out into the middle of the desert, and he picked up a shovel and said, "Dig a hole." So she dug the hole, and then he gave her the gun that he had in his glove compartment and said, "Shoot the dog." And instead of that, she shot herself. So the question is, at what point in this scenario did violence take place? At what point in this scenario did it become violent? What would you say? Anybody? Oh, way in the back. Okay, we have to give you the microphone, so it's coming up. Let me turn this on. How do you turn it on, actually?
In my opinion, the violence starts when he tells her to get in the car and she doesn't want to.
Why is that?
Because I don't think anybody should be forced to do anything that they don't need to do. And obviously, she only did it because she felt intimidated by him. And for me, this is violence.
Okay. And if you were reading the story in the news and you knew nothing about violence, could you tell objectively that that's when the violence began?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Because I think the common sense would say that the violence only started when the gun appeared in the game.
Right. Any other thoughts? So what this scenario helps us to see is how difficult it can be to assess incidents of violence that take place without having a very deep understanding of the context of a situation. So the way a journalist might report this story is simply that a woman committed suicide in the desert with her father after he forced her to dig a hole, and they would have no real background context into the incident, or they wouldn't have an in-depth understanding of how domestic violence takes place. And so if you were counting this incident, you might count it as a suicide, right? Even though we know that it was an example of domestic violence that resulted in someone taking their life. So basically, the story is a grim one, but the main purpose of it is to demonstrate why when a person like me is trying to collect data on violence across countries where the contexts are so different and across time from 1900 to 2015, where in any given day or any given week or month or year, the context could switch and provide more information about the background of the violence. It's necessary to focus on those observed acts and understand that there's a lot more we can't see. So what I'm going to talk about in the data that I'm going to present is observed acts of violence, the moment when somebody shoots the gun. And we have to sort of accept that we're missing a lot behind the story and just look at the political effects of those observed acts. So nonviolent action is action that might be highly disruptive and confrontational, but without threatening or directly harming the other person. Yes? Property? Okay, so the question is about property destruction. And I count that as violence in this data set, and the reason is because we, in our data collection, adopt the most conservative and strict versions of this definition so that critics can't say that we're including a lot of things as nonviolent action that aren't nonviolent action. I'll give you an example of why property destruction is so complex. In Egypt in 2011, in the Tahrir Square uprisings, there were about 12 different police stations that were burned to the ground by arsonists, and some people died there too. But they were burned to the ground, and it was not considered violent by the people. In fact, more people came to the protests because the police stations were burned to the ground. In other words, it was viewed as a legitimate act. Compare this to the United States, where in November of 2011, the Occupy movement in Oakland, California, had what it was boasting as its kind of most important march to the Oakland City Hall. And there were 5,000 people that joined this demonstration. And when they got to the City Hall, they pulled out an American flag and burned it. Guess what happened? Nobody ever showed up again to an Occupy Oakland protest because that was viewed as violent and demobilizing. Now, that's just context, right? That's what flies in someone's country, what's viewed as okay and not okay. And in the United States, burning an American flag is viewed as a very, very offensive and traitorous act, whether we like it or not. So the key here is knowing the context one's in. And from a practical point of view, I don't really know if it matters what's violent or not. The key for movements is what mobilizes people and what demobilizes people. If an act is demobilizing people, it's not strategically useful. If it's mobilizing people and bringing more out to the movement, it's strategically useful. And so a lot of times we can tell, whether an action is effective not by classifying it necessarily as nonviolent or violent, but more as classifying it as participation enhancing or participation reducing. So in the data that I've worked with, about 30% of nonviolent campaigns had significant elements of observed violence. So they're primarily nonviolent, but they have a small armed component. And there are two different categories of violent actors that can emerge at the same time as a nonviolent campaign. One is called an intra-movement violent flank. That means it's coming from within the movement, that participants from within the movement decide to use violence. Then there are extra-movement violent flanks. Those are people outside the movement who think it would be a good idea to help the movement along by using violence. So these are two types, and they actually have basically the same political effects. Now, there are a lot of arguments out there that I think deserve serious consideration about why this kind of violence should help a nonviolent movement. They actually make testable claims about the impacts that these violent flanks should have. And many of the arguments that one often hears for so-called diversity of tactics approaches or the use of violent flanks kind of line up a lot with these different hypotheses. So the first argument is that violent flanks should really raise the profile of the movement and its claims. It should make people pay attention and make them take the movement more seriously. This emerges from a strand of literature in political science that views violence as a costly signal. It demonstrates the commitment of the members, their resolve to see through the end game of the struggle, and their willingness to accept serious personal sacrifices and impose costs on their opponents to get what they want. The second set of arguments deals more with the issue of self-defense. The argument here is that sometimes a little bit of violence is necessary to defend the movement, its leaders, or its most vulnerable activists from the worst kinds of state violence. So the argument here is that by adopting even a self-defensive violent flank, it should reduce repression against the movement. The third hypothesis is that having a violent flank helps the movement to claim that it can escalate the struggle to a degree to where states are confronted with a serious and enduring national crisis. And the understanding here is that no government wants to have to deal with that. So having the violent flank shows that the movement can get really serious and escalate the struggle. The other argument that's more of a paradox is that the violent flank can help the nonviolent component of the movement look better. So in the civil rights movement, many people will say in the United States that Martin Luther King could never have won without Malcolm X. Malcolm X being somebody who advocated violence, Martin Luther King advocating nonviolence. The argument goes that the rise of Malcolm X helped Martin Luther King to look like the good guy that the government was willing to negotiate with. And so therefore, they were able to get more concessions precisely because the violent flank scared the government into conceding to the nonviolent movement. Another argument is that violent flanks help these movements to attract and retain very militant participants. So the most effective movements are going to have the participants who are the most radical and who use the most radical means. And by having violence as part of the movement's repertoire, it assures that the movement has a very intentional, radical commitment from its members, and that they can push the struggle forward when more moderate members fall away. And then finally, Howard Barrell, one of our colleagues from South Africa, has argued that in the case of the ANC at least, having some kind of militant, violent activity that was promoted by the violent wing of the ANC helped the nonviolent activists feel more of a common identity and a more robust oppositional culture, so that they weren't as afraid to engage in nonviolent action. And to demonstrate this example, he showed a lot of photographs of nonviolent ANC activists who were dressed in military clothing and carrying cardboard weapons during their marches. They were nonviolent marches, but they had cardboard weapons because it made them feel proud to be associated with a struggle that was willing to go all the way in order to win. So these are the arguments for why violent flanks should increase the leverage of otherwise nonviolent movements. There are also some arguments out there, largely from the civil resistance literature, but also some from the Civil War literature, about why violent flanks should hurt a nonviolent movement. So first, Gene Sharp and others have argued that when a movement adopts even a little bit of violence or tolerates even a little bit of violence from within, the problem becomes that the movement is now operating on a playing field where the regime has the decided advantage. So it's like showing up to a soccer game and it's your first time playing, whereas you're playing a World Cup gold medal team. The second problem is it's thought to discredit all of the regime's opposition actors. So when a movement adopts a violent flank or tolerates, embraces a violent flank, it's easier for the regime to say all of these people are terrorists, no matter whether they're endorsing violence or not, and so we will repress them all equally. In fact, there's a series of arguments out there from Sabina Carey and others that say that the moment when the most widespread repression takes place is the moment after a nonviolent movement starts to use limited amounts of violence. There's another argument that adopting a violent flank demobilizes the movement, not just through the repression mechanism, but also because many people who would otherwise participate in it don't want to anymore. So if you recall from yesterday, some of the data that I presented suggests that the most important factor for the success of any movement is its number and diversity of participants. And that's like, if there's one thing that makes movements succeed, it's that they're able to mobilize basically over 3.5% of the population. No movements have failed after mobilizing that proportion of the population. So what happens is if a violent flank becomes part of the movement's repertoire, a lot of the people who were participating because the movement was nonviolent don't want to show up. And anecdotally, when I've interviewed activists in places as diverse as Kosovo, South Africa, and elsewhere, it's often women and elderly people who say, as soon as the campaign starts getting violent, we leave. And part of the reason is because they don't want to accept the risks, the physical risks that come from being involved in the middle of a street fight. And another reason is because they feel that they are often disproportionately hurt when violence takes place. The same is true for many minority groups or people who are, maybe they have physical disabilities. And getting caught in the middle of a street fight is much more dangerous for them than for an able-bodied 20-year-old male. So what happens is that a significant proportion of the population no longer wants to participate actively in the campaign. That hurts the numbers, and hurting the numbers is always going to hurt the campaign. Another thing that can happen is that it can alienate would-be defectors or potential third-party supporters. So recall that another key dynamic of success is the ability of the campaign to elicit defections by the security forces or economic elites. And when campaigns start to use violence, it may be less likely that those defections take place. The other thing that might happen is it could decrease the ability of the campaign to evoke backfire when the campaign is repressed. In other words, observers might see repression against the campaign as more legitimate to restore order, as opposed to seeing repression against unarmed people as illegitimate and disproportionate in light of the threat. So as I said, these are really valid hypotheses, all of them pro and con, and they're also, fortunately, testable. So Kurt Schock and I published an article in the journal Mobilization in 2015, where we just very simply did kind of cross-tabulation of the success rates of nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks, and violent campaigns. And what we see is that the nonviolent campaigns are most effective in the long run. Nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks are in the middle, and then violent campaigns are the least effective. Now, the problem with these data is that we can't really understand the causality of this or the reasons why this might be taking place. And so what we did is, what I'm showing here is a study by Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughan, an economist at Middlebury College, who looked at the level of protests and strikes in France between 1900 and 2012. And what he was looking at here is the relative share by the week of violence and nonviolence used by French protesters and the effects that it had on whether they actually got what they wanted. That is, labor concessions mostly, or even things related to school holidays, changing dates, and weird stuff like that. And so what he found is actually that it is true that the more violence there was in a week, the less likely it was that these movements would get their concessions, that they would win in the end. So what are the mechanisms leading to this? Kurt and I looked at some of our data from NAVCO and found that participation, the demobilization effect, is one of the key mechanisms. It is true that nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks tend to be smaller than nonviolent campaigns without them. In fact, they're about 17% smaller on average. And our sense is it's because it drives away people with these more moderate risk profiles or who don't want to participate in street fighting. Now, the problem circled in the red circle there is that we have a very small N, and so a small number of observations. So these data are what I would call speculative, but findings that rely on a sample of less than 100 cases using statistical analysis are very unstable. So fortunately, another scholar named Elizabeth Tompkins did a study at the same time Kurt and I did ours, where she actually looked at the change over time. So can you actually find a relationship between the emergence of a violent flank and then subsequent demobilization? And she found that that is the case, that actually violent flanks lead to demobilization. It's not that movements develop violent flanks because they don't have enough people. there's that important question, do violent flanks protect movements from state violence? Tompkins actually finds the answer is no. Movements with violent flanks experience a much higher intensity and degree of violence after the fact than movements without. So the self-defense argument is very difficult, even though in the short term, in a tactical sense, violence might protect somebody right now in the moment through self-defense. The political effects are that more repression comes against the movement after the fact. A very important paper by Omar Wassow evaluated a really interesting set of data that looked at black protests in the United States from 1960 through 1973. And what he was looking at is trying to understand the impacts that those protests had on public opinion in the United States as a whole toward what was the most important issue. So the green line on top are nonviolent protests that were black-led, meaning part of the campaign to desegregate the country and to get black people equal rights in the United States. So what you can see is there was a huge number of black-led nonviolent protests from about 1963 until about 1965. And as that demobilized, you can start to see the increase in more violent protest activities that took place in the latter part of the civil rights movement. So you could argue that the green line is the King's nonviolent movement, and the red line is the Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. So what Wassow wanted to do is understand what were the impacts of these changes over time on public opinion by the rest of the United States. So what you can see is these are public opinion polls that came out every single month during the same time period in the Washington Post, I think. And people were asked, what is the most important issue facing our country today? And they had four choices: foreign affairs, the economy, social control, or civil rights. Civil rights is the one most associated with black liberation. Social control, by the way, is the one most dominated by the right-wing, anti-black, white supremacist movement. So what we can see here is a scatter plot with some trend lines showing that the peak of concern among Americans in the United States came right before 1965, at the peak of the nonviolent movement. That's when more Americans claimed that civil rights were the most important issue facing our country today than any other issue. And this was also, by the way, during the Vietnam War. So that's why foreign affairs is very high. So how does it track, actually, with the data on protests? It's very striking. As you can see here, public opinion that civil rights is the most important issue facing our country today tracks almost perfectly with the number of nonviolent protests led by black people in the South primarily. Look what happens, though, in the latter part of the 60s and early 70s as black-led protests become more violent. All of a sudden, public opinion polls suggest that the most important issue facing our country today is law and order. That is, maintaining social control, making it stop. So public opinion is starting to shift, not just the opinion of the government. What are the effects of public opinion on the way that these longer-term kind of political decisions are decided? Wassow uses several polls to try to correlate responses about the most important issue facing the country today with support for different political candidates. Probably none of you know any of the people from the 1968 US presidential election. That's great, then fine. But I'll tell you, Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee who won in the end. Does anybody know who Richard Nixon is? So you know, okay, that's Richard Nixon. George Wallace, has anybody ever heard that name? George Wallace was a very infamous governor of Alabama who was a segregationist, white supremacist. He was very famous for appearing at the front of the University of Alabama to prevent the United States National Guard from forcing the university to allow black students in. And he stood at the door and faced them down and said, "You'll have to kill me in order to let a black person onto this campus." That was George Wallace. Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic nominee. What these polls show is the way that people's response to law and order is the most important issue in this country correlated to their vote during the primaries for the presidential candidate. So you can see that both Richard Nixon and George Wallace are wiping out the Democratic candidate who was pro-desegregation, the person that was trying to continue civil rights in the country. So, in other words, public opinion was tracking very closely to electoral behavior. In fact, Wassow argues, and this is a very difficult and poignant simulation that he runs, and this is kind of hard to make out on the chart, but basically what he argues is that if the protests had stayed nonviolent throughout this time period, that Hubert Humphrey would have won the election in a landslide. And in fact, that a Democratic president, a liberal president, would have won every election in the United States since 1968. So it has long-term political impacts. And it's disturbing and upsetting because the moral responsibility should never belong to the victims of a horrible system, right? Yet what we can see is that the choices that we make in contentious politics can ultimately have very long-lasting political effects. And in our data, one thing that we were very interested in understanding is the effects of adopting a violent flank on whether the country experiences a major civil war within 10 years. And the results here are also very striking, that adopting or embracing a violent flank in the short term, even as a tactical matter to protect oneself in the short term, can result in much higher probabilities that the country polarizes to such an extent that it devolves into civil war within a decade. So I'm convinced by the accumulation of this empirical evidence that violent flanks typically are more trouble than they are helpful for nonviolent campaigns. The reason is because they tend to demobilize the diversity and numbers of participants. They tend to drive away potential third-party supporters. They tend to elicit even worse repression against the campaign and anybody associated with the campaign, and overall decrease the likelihood that these campaigns will succeed in the end. There are also long-term consequences, including marginalizing the political power of these movements for decades to come politically, but also increasing overall chances of more large-scale violence in the country. So here are some options for nonviolent campaigns where they have violent flanks that show up or emerge from within. Now, it's true that some campaigns are able to withstand these political effects and win in spite of violent flanks. This might be true for the ANC in South Africa. It might be true for the Kosovo independence movement in Kosovo. In places where the repression is so intense against these people in the first place that it doesn't really matter. Everybody is going to participate no matter what kind of method they're using. That said, for the political effects to take place that would create the most powerful dynamics of nonviolent action, these campaigns generally need to find a way to outnumber the violent flanks in terms of the number of people participating. Movements can also do extensive preparation, planning, and training to make sure that their activists don't inadvertently use violence and then have to go down that path. I've witnessed a lot of different protests. I'm like a protest magnet, I told Rebecca on the first day. Everywhere I go, there's a protest. Anyway, so I've seen a lot of them, and I've seen a lot of them go this way, to where things are getting really intense. People are starting to get really angry at one another. Maybe there are really offensive things being said. It's difficult, especially in conditions where people are subjected to all kinds of oppression and daily indignities, for them to stand there and take abuse. And so I have seen before where people just lose it, and they start attacking one another, or the police provoke them, and then they start fighting. And actually, Stephen Zunis told me a story once about a fellow who came from the north to the south in Alabama to participate in the civil rights movement. He was like a football player, and he went to some nonviolence trainings, and they were training him how to sit there when people were trying to provoke him into punching them. So he was sitting in a chair in a church where they held these trainings, and somebody like burned a cigarette on his arm, and he turned around and punched the guy in the face. And they said, okay, that's what you don't want to do. See if next time when we insult you and push you, that you don't turn around and punch the person. So they try again. He's like, okay, I got it. I'm breathing. And they kind of push him, and he turns around and punches the person in the face. And they're like, okay, maybe you're not cut out for being right on the front line, but you'd be a great bus driver, right? So then the guy was the very courageous bus driver, but he didn't get to sit in with the rest of the students, right? So sometimes it's these trainings and preparations can allow movements to understand what their human capacity is for this. In the civil rights movement, many people were killed in the courses of marches. Children were killed. Children were killed in their homes with bombs and things like that. And so on Sundays, they would often have the sermons be replaced by a conversation with the congregation. The question was, will we march on Thursday? And the congregation would debate it. And sometimes they would decide, we cannot march on Thursday because we are too hurt, and we can't do it. We can't maintain the discipline on Thursday to march. So they wouldn't. Other times they would say, we will march on Thursday, but it will be a silent march, both to honor the people who've been killed and also to make sure that none of us get so emotional that we lash out. So silent marches are sometimes a form of self-discipline. They also can be a way of identifying infiltrators. Because if everybody knows we're doing a silent march, and then this guy over here is screaming and hollering, we know he's not part of the movement. So in terms of the tactical approaches to managing this issue, many people will actually engage in what's called interpositioning. And that's when they have a group of people dedicated in a large protest or demonstration whose job it is to stand between people who are very emotional and maybe not as well trained in nonviolent action and the police. So they are kind of like a barrier, and they're part of the movement, but they're just preventing the movement and the police from attacking one another. In the United States, there was a group called Veterans for Peace. There are thousands and thousands of members of this movement. And during the Occupy movement, when the police were attacking protesters, Veterans for Peace volunteered to interposition between the movement and the police. And what they said is that we are pro-peace veterans, but as veterans, as military men and women, we have taken a sworn oath to defend our country from violence. And so we are willing to accept attacks on our bodies. We have decided that many years ago, and we will stand between the police and the protesters. So in Occupy Chicago, there was some 1,000 of Veterans for Peace that went through nonviolence training and interpositioned during Occupy events. Another thing that can be done is assigning monitors or peacekeepers to these events. One of my favorite stories about this comes from Serbia, where occasionally there were hundreds of thousands of people who were participating in the movement to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. Not a single person died, except for one guy who died of a heart attack and one person who died in a car accident on the way to the protest. But not anybody else was killed in that entire time. And one of the strategies that the movement had was to have 40 or so peacekeepers or monitors who would kind of walk around and look to see that everybody was sort of following the rules. They had sent out a list of rules or agreements that this is the way we behave at protest. If you want to participate, you behave this way. And they would just make sure everybody was in accordance with that. And at one point, there was a series of people that they looked like they were trying to provoke the police. So this group of 40 people just surrounded them like this, like a tight circle, and just started walking like this. Well, if you're in the middle of that, you can't, you're just going with them. And then they had all these taxis lined up beside the main square. And they threw this guy in the back of the taxi and told the driver to take him 10 kilometers out of town. And that's it, right? So, so that can be done. That has been done. It's very effective. It can be controversial in some movements because it feels like policing. But really, it's movements trying to maintain who they are. Another thing that is even more controversial is turning in people that are using violence or potential infiltrators or agents provocateurs, turning them into the police. Now, this is very controversial in context where the police are very untrustworthy or where the people protesting have been subjected to horrific abuse by the police. But if there's a suspicion that somebody is an infiltrator or an agent provocateur or a plainclothes policeman trying to provoke the movement into violence, it can be a very clever tactic, which is, hey, we found this person in our movement who looks like they're about to violate the law. Perhaps you might want to take care of it. It can be a very clever way of undermining a police strategy of infiltration. Now, of course, in terms of the political effects, one thing that movements can do is they can denounce the violence. They can say, look, here are the rules that we pass out in advance, the guidelines for participation. If people aren't doing that, they're not us, period. And they can also distance themselves from the perpetrators of violence, which is to say, basically saying that, you do your thing and we'll do our thing, but you don't do your thing at our thing. So that has happened too, and that happens, I think, in a lot of movement spaces today around Western democracies in particular. So one of the things that I did that's just kind of interesting to me, it was a curiosity. I was very interested in understanding how many movements today reference Mahatma Gandhi in what they do. And part of the reason I was interested in this is because the explosion of nonviolent campaigns around the world basically started with Gandhi. So there were campaigns before Gandhi, but they didn't really have a name. The term civil resistance was articulated first by Gandhi, kind of inspired by the book Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. And so Gandhi used that term civil resistance for the first time and gave it its name. And then we've seen this explosion of movements worldwide. So does anybody know what Google Ngram is? Google Ngram? So it's one of these beta things in Google where you can go to Google Ngram and you can put in any word or words, And it will tell you how many books have been published referencing that word since 1800. So, you know, it's beta, whatever. It's kind of cheesy, but I was really curious, how often is Gandhi mentioned in books today, in the period where more people are using civil resistance than ever before? And it turns out that basically mentions of Gandhi peaked like right at the end of the anti-colonial period, and then basically nobody talks about him anymore. And I think that's really strange and unfortunate, because Gandhi was a pragmatist. His whole concept of satyagraha and civil resistance was related not just to the fact that it could bring kind of spiritual liberation to people, but also strategic power, people power. And in his autobiography and various works written about Gandhi by others, there's very clear discussion about the process that Gandhi recommended and that he himself undertook in order to prosecute an effective civil resistance campaign in the Salt March. And the first step in nonviolent action for him was like self-seeking, research, and preparation. It was an intensive period of understanding one's own strengths and weaknesses, the strengths and weaknesses of a collective claim that would form the basis of a movement, understanding where the population was, what their capacities are right now to wield their power effectively, and then what can be done to support and build on those capacities such that they could realize and unleash their power. Now, Gandhi's first step in nonviolent action lasted like 10 to 12 years in India, where there was a dedicated decade to trying to evaluate where we are right now, before the Salt March even came about. And this was after he had spent years in South Africa doing very similar type of work as a labor lawyer there. So the first Gandhian step in understanding the environment, what the capacities are, and how can we collectively wage struggle in a way that brings us dignity and power. And then came the strategic plan, which is understanding where do we want to be and what sequence of tactics will we take to get there. And, you know, using this different method of nonviolent action, he was able to mobilize like 320 million Indians. And that's an astonishing achievement for the Salt March. And so, you know, for me, one of the questions is, how can we recover some of the philosophical roots and foundations of principled and sort of spiritual nonviolent action in ways that might help contemporary movements reclaim some of those earlier successes and sort of regenerate them in their contexts? And I think that you know, part of what I see with a lot of contemporary movements is that they only focus on the tactics and actually they mostly focus on tactics, not even so much on strategy. So they're sort of like, what are we going to do next week? The average nonviolent campaign takes about 3 years to run its course. So I don't know too many movements around the world that think in terms of a 3-year strategy. And how are we going to sequence our tactics to get to where we want to go, instead of just what would be the most fun thing to do next week? And so, you know, my only kind of pitch here is to read Gandhi's autobiography. James Lawson, who was a main thinker of the US civil rights movement, once told me that you guys are so lucky today because you have so much material for how to plan and execute a nonviolent campaign. When I was in prison as a conscientious objector, all I had was Gandhi's autobiography. And that's how he learned about nonviolent struggle and transported it into the US civil rights movement. So I will leave it there and welcome your conversation, I think, for the next 15 minutes or so. That's it? Oh, come on, you were so talkative about this subject before.
Hi, my name is Isis. I want to know, why do you think the population in general doesn't see violence as something structural? Like, when we protest, we are like too radical, too much. We don't need to do so much noise. And I want to know, what do you think about that? Why do you think people don't see this as silencing these people and actually reinforcing the violence that's structural in society?
Great question. So this gets to the overall question of why some movements seem to resonate in given societies at given times and why some don't. And I can tell you that the entire field of sociology has been asking this question for 50 years and is still asking it. But what I can say from my own observation is that there seem to be a couple of important common features for when movements really start to bounce and get off the ground. One is timing. So a very trivial example of this is that I always wanted to write an article in the New York Times. It was like a life goal. And I would send articles and they'd reject them. Sometimes they wouldn't even reject them. They just would never publish them and never contact me again. It was very rude. Then during the Arab Spring, all of a sudden the New York Times called me and asked me if I would write an article because I knew something about nonviolent resistance. It was going to be the same article no matter what, but the timing was different. And I think that different societies react the same way at a macro level to whether a claim to authority and legitimacy makes sense today, right now. And so one of the things that was different, for example, in Tunisia in 2010, when Mohamed Bouazizi burned himself alive, was that for whatever reason, on that day, everybody experienced the pain of that. And what we don't know is why the 15 people who killed themselves in the previous 3 months in Tunisia in the exact same way did not have the same effect. There were 16 self-immolations in 3 months between October and December of 2010. We have no idea why we all know Mohamed Bouazizi's name and we don't know any of the others. So timing, and timing is a very difficult to nail down. The second factor, I think, deals with the methods. So do the methods that the movement is using resonate widely with the people? Are the methods something that makes sense to people that would not ordinarily participate in protest actions? Is it a method of action that has some kind of national significance or legitimacy, or is it not? So in France, for example, the strike is it. In France, the strike is viewed as very legitimate and powerful. And so it's not an accident that when people really want change, they use the strike. The third thing is about the specific claims that the movement is making. So I'll give you another example from my friend James Lawson. Now, James Lawson came back from India after studying at Gandhi's ashram in the late 50s. And Martin Luther King said to him, please go to Nashville and desegregate it. Imagine that, right? So somebody says, go to this city and fix systemic racism. Okay, so he goes to Nashville, and what he realized was that he didn't know the local needs. And he spent an entire year, a full year, every day, going door to door in black neighborhoods to talk to women who were at home with their kids about what bothers you day to day. And what he found out was very interesting. He found out that they were bothered by the fact that their children did not wear clothes that fit them, because when they went to department stores, their children were not allowed to try on the clothes or try on the shoes because they were black. and they were viewed as unclean. And if they bought the clothes and brought them home, they were not allowed to return the clothes if they didn't fit, for the same reason. And so these women said, it is deeply upsetting to me that I have to explain to my child why the white children can wear clothes that fit them and you can't. And so he heard this story over and over again in people's homes. And what he realized was, my job isn't to desegregate Nashville. My job is to desegregate department stores. Because what's going to happen is if we frame it in that way, all these women are going to come. They're all going to show up because that's what matters to them. That's what they care about. And he was right. The lunch counter sit-ins that took place and the subsequent department store strikes and boycotts were incredibly powerful. And they had made segregation of all commercial areas in Nashville illegal within 4 months after starting the contentious activity. It was because of the mass protest potential that was unleashed by framing the claim in a way that resonated with local people's immediate needs. And so I guess the three things I'd say then are timing, methods, and the nature of the claim itself. Does it really resonate? If those three things are there and it's still not working, I have no idea. But it might be one of those three things. Yes.
Vou perguntar em português mesmo. Eu queria te perguntar um pouco sobre o modelo de contrafactual em que se apresentou ali que o democrata teria sido eleito, né? Se os protestos não tivessem sido tão violentos e tal. Como é que você articulou, enfim, as variáveis ou os elementos para poder estruturar aquele modelo e chegar àquele resultado?
Oh, yeah. Okay, we'll take one more.
Boa tarde. Assim, tô achando muito interessante o seminário, tô repensando essa questão da eficácia e ineficácia da violência, embora eu ache que é é muito complexo quantificar de forma causal violência e sucesso. Acho que são parâmetros bem complicados de se mexer, assim, porque ambas as coisas são variáveis, assim, violência patrimonial ser considerada violência, ou sucesso ser... O que é sucesso, né? Dependendo de cada contexto, são situações muito diversas. O exemplo que a gente deu mais cedo, de manhã, sobre o passo estudantil, por exemplo, como é que vai comparar isso com a Tunísia e tal. E outra coisa que eu refleti é sobre... Eu achei interessante o gráfico sobre os protestos de pessoas negras serem, se entende bem, mal vistos mais fácil. E eu fiquei pensando se não é quase religioso esperar que grupos que têm seus direitos civis cerceados uma vida inteira sejam sempre pacifistas, assim. Porque eu acho que, no final, se existe supremacistas brancos, eles são só um exemplo extremado de um ódio racial que é disseminado na sociedade inteira. Então, colocar que sempre vai fluir melhor se a gente for paciente, eu só penso naquela frase, paciente não, mas pacífico, né? Eu penso na frase de nenhum grupo oprimido ganha direitos apelando para o senso moral de seus opressores. Porque, no final, essas opressões todas elas são muito baseadas em desumanização. Então, é bastante complicado esperar que se seja pacífico quando não se tem direito nenhum, assim. Quando você, sei lá, você é um trabalhador, você já tem pouco direito, mas aí vai se somando várias opressões cruzadas e, no final, são pessoas marginalizadas de um jeito tão extremo. Como é que você não vai querer quebrar algo? Como com tanta opressão a gente não vai querer quebrar as coisas?
I got it. I've heard this one before. One more.
One more.
It's not actually a question, it's more of something I wanted to add to what you said. And I see that personally, Black people are often seen as more violent. It's something that happens in Brazil a lot, I think in the United States too, that we have to be pacific because otherwise we won't be heard. If anything I say calmly, it will be turned into something violent. People will often say I'm too radical, I'm too violent, or the stereotypical way we are seeing.
Absolutely, very good points. So the first question about the model. I should say this is not my model. It's a professor at Princeton named Omar Wasow, who studies race and politics in the United States. I cannot remember all of the factors that go into the model, but he does try to account for all of the different historical, economic, political, social, and environmental factors that are correlated with votes for different parties. So it's a quite robust model. He also uses instrumental variable approaches, including things like average rainfall and temperature to try to proxy for different economic indicators that would also perhaps be correlated with the protests. So it's quite a good working paper. If you Google Omar Wasow and go to his working paper page, you can get the entire document. It's a really interesting paper. So this question about oppressed people. And when people are oppressed, isn't it natural to expect them to want to just break something? Yes, of course. Of course. And also, it's quite expected. And I think that part of the reason why in the civil rights movement they went to such great lengths to use nonviolent action was precisely to destroy the perception that Black people, by a function of their Blackness, were criminals. And so, in fact, there were deliberate attempts to engage in what many people now criticize as respectability politics. And respectability politics meaning that the activists would actually wear clothing like suits and ties and things that they couldn't be attacked for being criminal. And they did it deliberately. They had very open meetings where this was discussed and recorded on video. And I think it's very upsetting morally. I think it's very upsetting. I also think that it's equally upsetting that that there can't be a way out of the cycle of violence. And the question is not what's morally comfortable as much to me as what's going to make the change. And I don't know that these data suggest that by engaging in what's expected, that change is made, expected by white supremacists, I mean. And so, I think that it really depends on whether you buy the overall theory of why civil resistance works, which is, do you agree that the main function of a popular movement is to increase the numbers of people participating, to pull in people that ordinarily wouldn't participate, to expand the range of participants such that you have direct access to creating defections on the other side, and whether that then can unleash political processes that lead to real change. And if you don't agree that that's how uprisings work, then I don't think you need to really know the difference between violence and nonviolence, because you might have a different theory of change. For me, the theory of change that's most convincing to me is the one I've presented, which unfortunately requires oppressed people to behave at a standard higher than their opponents. And it's really morally disturbing. But it's what the evidence suggests. So yeah, I mean, I think what you point out is exactly right. It's totally unfair, completely unfair. And I think also politics is incredibly unfair. Okay, this is the last question.
Eu vou perguntar em português. Ultimamente a gente tem visto uma crescente violência verbal em páginas online, né? Então, por exemplo, plataformas como Facebook, enfim. E o algoritmo desse... Então, tendo duas coisas em mente. O algoritmo desses sites, ele proporciona que você veja cada vez mais aquilo que você quer ver. Então, tendo também em mente algumas coisas como, por exemplo, o Manuel Castells, ele vai falar que a internet foi vital para protestos, enfim, manifestações como a Primavera Árabe. Então, tendo em mente esses dois aspectos, a gente pode relacionar essa crescente violência online, verbal, com a violência em protestos, em manifestações?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you should study that question. And what you should do is come up with some systematic way to collect these horrific bullying things online and use a content analysis approach to understanding the links between an increase in polarizing or hate speech online and actual incidences of violence. You should totally do that. And what I would say is that, from my impression, the internet is destroying humanity, contrary to expectations. And actually, you know, there is this widespread belief that social media was integral to especially the Arab uprisings. I'm very skeptical of this argument. I think characteristics are not causes, right? And that actually shutting down the internet brought more people out to the streets than using the internet to organize people. I also think that if there was a communication advantage for the internet, it was over long before the Arab Spring, because regimes figured out how to use the internet to surveil people very kind of late in the color revolutions. So like 2009, 2010, I think was maybe a tipping point where regimes were able to use the internet more effectively than activists. In fact, in Sudan, there was a very chilling episode in January of 2011 where the Sudanese government put out a call for a protest event that was like New Democracy or something. And they hired a graphic artist to make the profile photo like really cool, like a youth, like a very cool youth protest that everybody would want to go to. And so like 17,000 people RSVP'd to this protest online and then showed up, and the regime rounded up all the organizers that came at the beginning and tortured them and got their Facebook passwords and then rounded up everybody else. So it's a very scary thing, I think, social media, and a lot of activists now are off social media precisely because of this issue. So I don't know, I think the growth in nonviolent campaigns definitely preceded the advent of the internet, and I'm kind of an internet skeptic. At this point, I think it's, as you point out, a self-selection device where people only have to interact with people that agree with them, and it's creating all kinds of weird new realities that don't coexist with one another very well. This is just opinion. I have no data to back this up, but you probably do, though. So that's it. Thanks.